Okay guys, so we are going to do some notes on multiplying and dividing with numbers and scientific notation. You're going to have to ignore the music that's happening in the background because I'm having to do my video from a hotel lobby right now. I can explain all that another time, but you'll have to try your best to ignore it. So you can see in your notes that the first top is all about adding and subtracting numbers in scientific notation. We went over that yesterday, so I'm not actually going to go over the how-to with you here. Remember that if they have the same power of 10, you just add or subtract those front numbers like normal. If they do not have the same powers of 10, like these numbers don't right here, then you're going to use this calculator right here. You're going to go to this calculator, desmos.com/scientific, and you're going to type these numbers into the scientific calculator exactly as you see them. The only thing I am going to do is I'm going to make sure that you put your parentheses in the right place. So we should have parentheses after that number, and then parentheses here with that number. And then for each of these, you have to make sure that you add your parentheses in whenever you're putting them into your Desmos scientific calculator. Otherwise, you all are just going to input these numbers into the scientific calculator and make sure you give me your answers in scientific notation. Okay, so again, I'm not going to go over how to do this with you. If you need to know how to do it, then you can go back to our notes and your notes/homework from yesterday, and you can look over that again and see how we did it there. So right now you need to pause the video, and you're going to do numbers 1 through 6, adding and subtracting numbers in scientific notation with your desmos.com/scientific calculator. Go ahead and pause the video now. Okay, so you should have paused the video so that you're able to do those first 6 problems, adding and subtracting numbers in scientific notation. Now we're going to go ahead and do the multiplication and division with numbers in scientific notation. The only thing I don't like about these notes here is that it only shows an example of multiplying the numbers in scientific notation. It only shows those steps. So I'm going to add a little bit to it here. We're always going to do step number 1, which is split the expressions into constants and powers of 10. Your constants are those first numbers out front in scientific notation right here, and then the powers of 10, of course, are the ones that are second. We're always going to do that, and then the second step, it says multiply the constants. Sometimes though, we are going to have to divide the constants. Some of these are multiplication problems and some of these are division problems. So I'm adding some division instructions in there also. Step 2 would either be to multiply the constants or divide the constants, whichever one the problem calls for. Step 3 says multiply the powers of 10. Remember the product rule. That only applies to multiplication. If you are dividing the constants, then you're going to divide. It doesn't like it when I type, so I'm going to have to write it out. Divide the powers of 10. And if you have to divide the powers of 10, you're going to remember your quotient rule. So when it talks about the product rule and the quotient rule, we're talking about your exponent rules. And if you're in the classroom, then you can still see them over there on the board. Otherwise, if you're my virtual kids, you're going to have to go back to your notes and be able to look back at what does the product rule tell you to do and what does the quotient rule. We'll cover it briefly here, but since we've already learned those things, you need to make sure if you're not quite, if you don't quite remember them the way they need to be remembered, then you need to go back and review those a little bit. After we multiply or divide the powers of 10, then we're going to make sure we put our answer in scientific notation. Okay, so now I'm going to show you what each of these look like. I'm going to go through most of these problems on here. I'm going to do 2 multiplication problems, I'm going to do 2 division problems, and then the other 2 you all are going to be responsible for. For number 1, right, we are multiplying 2 powers, and they're both in scientific notation. Our step 1 says we need to split the expressions into constants and powers of 10. What that looks like, I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. What that looks like is instead of having one number in scientific notation times another number in scientific notation, we're going to separate them out, the numbers that are out front times each other, and then the powers of 10 times each other. So this is what that looks like. 9.34 times 5.2. So you see I have the constants being multiplied together first, and then my second set of brackets, we're going to multiply the power of 10. 10 to the 4th times 10 squared. You see I separated out my constants and my powers of 10. These are going to be multiplied together, and then these are going to be multiplied together using our product rule because we're doing multiplication. The second step says that I need to multiply the constants since we're talking about multiplication. That's these numbers here. You guys can use your calculator for this step. So I have 9.34 times 5.2. I'm going to pull up my calculator. We have 9.34 times, and of course I forgot that number already, 5.2. And that equals 48.568. So now I have 48.568 as the first number in scientific notation times the power of 10, and then we're going to use our product rule to take care of these powers. The product rule says, this is from our exponents unit, that if you're multiplying two powers and they have the same base, you're going to keep the base and just add those exponents together. So we have 10 to the 4 plus 2, which is 6th power. Now this part is where we do have to make some adjustments because our number has to be in scientific notation, but if you notice, this has 2 digits out in front of the decimal, and we've got to make sure it has 1. So we have to think about, what do I have to do to make sure this number gets put into scientific notation? I would have to move this decimal over one place so that it says 4.8568. If we change the first number, then we have to make sure that we change our exponent also. So this is where we were talking a little bit yesterday that we have to think about what direction do we normally put numbers into scientific notation, what happens there. If you're moving left, like I just did, that means you have positive exponents. Whenever we're putting numbers into scientific notation, if we have to move left, it's always a positive exponent, which means we would be adding an exponent on. If we do end up moving right, anytime we've moved right while putting numbers into scientific notation, remember that's what we're doing here. We're taking this and putting it into scientific notation. Then those are negative exponents, which means you're subtracting exponents from your power. Since I moved to the left, which is what I did here, I moved one place over to the left, that means I have to add one exponent to my number here. So I have now, if I have 6 plus that 1 that I just moved over, it's going to be 4.8568 times 10 to the 7th power. Now that I've adjusted my number, it's actually in scientific notation so that this is the proper response. Okay, so that's an example of a number in that is being multiplied together here. Okay, now we have, I'm going to do number 2 next, that has a number two numbers in scientific notation that are being divided. Okay, our first step is always the same. We're going to separate those expressions into constants and powers of 10. I'm going to change my color here. So I have now 3.75, and that's being divided by 4. Remember, it's always got to be this number divided by this number every single time. That's the constants, and then we're going to take care of our powers of 10. We have 10 to the 10th power being divided by 10 to the 8th power. Second step is to divide the constants just by themselves. I'm going to use my calculator. I have 3.75 divided by 4. Make sure I clear this one out. 3.75 divided by 4, and that equals 0.9375. So now we have 0.9375. You can see it's not going to be in scientific notation right away, so we are going to have to adjust that. But first, let's take care of our exponents. If we're dividing numbers in scientific notation, that means we're going to have to use the quotient rule on our powers. The quotient rule says that if you're dividing two powers and they have the same base, you're going to keep the base and you're going to subtract those exponents from each other. 10 minus 8 is 2. So now I have to adjust this number to make it fit into scientific notation, and we're still going to use what we did up here. In order to fix this first number and put it into scientific notation, I would have to move one digit back so that we have 9.375. According to my little chart I made up here, if I'm moving right, that means I need to subtract an exponent from my power. So then I have 9.375 times 10 to minus that 1 that we had to subtract is going to be 10 to the first power. Here is our number in scientific notation. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and do number 3 for you also. It's another multiplication problem. Switch colors. First step is to always separate the constants from the powers. So this is actually going to be 1.8 times 2.02. And then we're going to have the powers being multiplied together. That's 10 to the 5th times 10 squared. Second step is to go ahead and multiply these constants together, and I'm going to use my calculator. It's 1.8 times 2.02. 1.8 times 2.02. That equals 3.636. 3.636. As you can see, this number is already in our scientific notation format, so we shouldn't have to adjust this when we're done. All we have left to do is to take care of those powers of 10. Since we're multiplying the two numbers in scientific notation, we've got to use our product rule to be able to take care of these powers. It says if you're multiplying two powers and they have the same base, you're going to keep the base and we're going to add those exponents. 5 plus 2 is 7. This number, because it already has a number between 1 and 10 in front, is already in scientific notation. I'm going to do one more with you guys, and then you are going to be responsible for numbers 5 and number 6. This is a division problem, but the step starts out the same. We're going to separate our constants and our powers of 10. So we're going to have 4.21 being divided by 1. That's the very first part. And then we're going to take care of our powers of 10, which is going to be 10 to the 6th divided by 10 to the 3rd. We shouldn't need a calculator for this. The next step is to take care of my constants here. 4.21 divided by 1 is just going to be the same number. It's still going to be 4.21. And all we have left to do is just to take care of our powers. So for our powers, something right here. For our powers, we're going to use the quotient rule. Okay, and the quotient rule, all it says is that we're dividing two powers and they have the same base. We always keep our base and we subtract those exponents. 6 minus 3 is going to be 3. Because our first number is already a number between 1 and 10, then you don't have to adjust it. This is our answer in scientific notation. Alright guys, that is it. You can go back and view the video as many times as you need to. You are responsible for taking care of problems number 5 and problem number 6. That's just 2 problems on your own here. Okay? Good luck, guys. Make sure you go back and pause the video, review it as many times as you need to get this step down.